I'm back at it again, everybody. Sorry this video took so long to get out. I've been busy. I'm levitating, apparently, when I crouch doing that emote. But this is what I've been up to. I built this a little while ago. This is a Czech-inspired castle tower. I was experimenting with a sort of palette and design that I could copy and replicate across an entire castle build. That's typically how I build these. And I thought I would come through and make another how-to video on how to make something like this. Or how to make this exactly, I would say. The general rules of thumb, things I like to do, things I like to go for, and things I've discovered when building like this in Vintage Story. So, for the base wall texture, it's pretty straightforward. I'm no expert at block blending, but the general gist is to make 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So here we're just gonna do a small little mini tower, because obviously it would take me ages to reconstruct this in a how-to video. So we're just gonna go over the basic principles. You can scale up this pattern to any size you like. You can make this a gargantuan castle for giants if you wanted to. Although I guess the sheriffs are already kind of giants. Point being, the principle for blending this texture here, this is a granite ashlar bricks and granite rock that really all you do, and the way I like to think about it, this is a technique I've been trying to master that a lot of very good Minecraft builders do very well, is block blending. So how I like to think of it is you do it in blobs, right? So you'll notice there's like a patch of stone brick there, and then there's this weird little shape here, and it makes a nice blending texture. A lot of blending and how I used to blend that is kind of not optimal, doesn't look as good, is when you just come through and you kind of randomly blend. You just click and replace randomly. That can look nice if you have a very specific purpose for it, but it gets very noisy, especially when you're using these high contrast textures. We have a very dark and noisy brick, something a lot cleaner like the rock. When you blend like this, it can look good, but especially when you start getting more complicated and you start mixing in other block colors and other block textures into your blend here, it becomes almost like block vomit is the best way I can describe it. Is you don't really have a rhyme or reason to where you're placing these blocks. It's more of just throw spaghetti at the wall and see if it sticks. That's how I used to blend a lot in my old Minecraft builds. But I have seen the light. I have seen the light. This works much better. As you can see, looking... Hello, clothes. I totally don't take off my clothes and throw them in the bushes when I create these worlds. I'm wearing armor. I'm just going commando underneath. No, I have clothes. But, although slight gripe, I just noticed in the new 1.21.1 update, they made it so boots don't clip through armor anymore. So my squire boots don't show anymore. That made me kind of angry, because it added a little like glitched effect that made the plate legs look cooler. It's tangent aside. With the block blending, you'll notice for these walls, it is very blob-like. It looks almost like a camouflage is the best way I can put it in order to blend and make that look nice. So how you do that very simply is to just go around the corners, fill in. I like to do noisier textures along the bottom, at least for like the primary faces of the wall. Obviously you can mix and match, blend however you like. This one's a little different. I think there's a little too much brick in this wall, but really when it comes to blending, it is all about just kind of having an eye for it, and that you develop just by doing it more and more often. So you'll see it's a little trickier at small scale. But the idea is there. You go and you make sort of connected chunks of textures that then blend nicely with the other ones, like that. That's a tip I learned from Hermitcraft, of all things. So, we're gonna make this a little taller because it's gonna give us a little more space to show off. I'm not gonna do a full detailing. What I'm gonna do is I'm gonna show each of these features on one side of each wall just to give you a basic overview of how they are made, and I will discuss what they are, why they look like that, and what their purpose was in historical European castles, or historical castles in general. I believe many features of castles were stolen. The same way that it's good to steal builds and references in really any kind of art form. Yeah, it's definitely a lot harder at these smaller scales. It's a little trickier. You kind of just gotta sit there and play with it to get it to look nice. But the main kind of rule of thumb that I like to keep in mind when doing this is, like I said, with like camouflage, almost like a cheater pattern. Yes, a cheetah pattern. You don't want a lot of connections between the blobs like this. See, I want to put those bricks there. It becomes a very different visual than when you have a nice separation between the two. I think it helps. The space helps your eyes see the bigger picture. Whereas if I were to take a bunch of finer details like I blocked in that space, it becomes a bit overwhelming to look at. But that's just what do you call that? That is just my musings, I suppose. So there we go. That's a simple overview of how block blending works. Weirdly enough, when I block blend, I tend to work in the same diagonal pattern all across each face. You'll notice, especially on here, it becomes almost like a S shape. It's a little different on here, but it's something I fall into a lot when I'm building. The important thing is to not fall into the same pattern on every face of the wall. You kind of just have to make it vary up the blobs on each face, just to make things a little different. Makes it look a little nicer. So that is how you do the basic flat wall. This is more of detail work, but I'll go ahead and go over it now. These little extrusion things, similar to my cobblestone walls on the medieval houses, these are very, very simple and in a chiseling technique that I think is very useful. So what these are just the granite ashlar blocks chiseled down to the size of a brick. So how that is done, let me grab my chisel, my copper chisel, yes. I've never made it past the copper age on my own. So you just cut off the front, cut off the top, and then, yep. And then you just take the 4x4, cut off the face, take the 2x2, cut off the face even more. I think I did this one somewhat wrong. Nope, that's fine. That's fine. Lining it up with the actual brick texture itself when chiseling is a little tricky, but I think generally speaking it looks fine. Regardless? Yeah, actually, it's weird. It might inherit some of the texture of the... Huh, that's weird. When I block pig this, it shows up as 2 bricks, but on there, it's 1. Huh, okay. There's some technical reason for that, but that is how you make these little brick things. And it's super, super simple. All you have to do is place one down, get your wrench. I'm not sure if these are in survival, but I hope. And you just rotate it to the face of the wall. And then you come along and you place the same horizontal block across the entire face of the wall. So this is very, very easy to do. Once you get the block chiseled, it's just place it down, rotate it against the wall, and place a bunch of them, right? Super simple, super easy. And the very, very nice thing about this technique is it's super light on the chiseling work. really all I had to do was chisel one brick and then use the same orientation, the same identical brick on every face of the wall, just a little rotated. And you get a very, very nice effect that just helps the wall pop, you know, helps it look a little more nice to look at. A little more dynamic. It's a word I like to use a lot. But the nice thing about this is if I were to build this at scale, right, this is a single castle tower. In a full castle, I build anywhere up to like 9 to 12 of these things, connect them with walls for like a city, castle style city walls. It's a lot of towers that you have to replicate. And so if I were to come through here and make a brick at the lower orientation, a brick at the upper orientation, and then I had to mix between the two and try and blend it to make it look nice and get every block looking nice. It's just a lot of extra work that is very easily skipped. Something you don't even really have to do, because by just using that bottom brick, you get the level of detail and it breaks up those blobs a little more. You'll notice around, where's one? Here. Here, this is just the brick overlaid the rock texture. It makes the blob look even finer because now it's like a half slab of the rock texture that's actually visible. So when you get at larger walls and larger scales, especially like down here, for example, this is all rock lined with that single brick extrusion texture there. And now the blob doesn't look so blocky anymore. When in reality, I didn't have to chisel the block underneath at all. All I did was come around and place almost a facade on top of it to make it look a lot noisier, a lot chunkier, which is not very historical, but for the sake of block game, it looks great, in my opinion. And that's how you do it. Super simple, super quick, and would be very easily to work with. Very easily, Jesus. Would be very easy to work with at large scale. All you would have to do is place all your castle walls, your castle towers in the basic shape like this for the whole castle, and then you just go through with all these bricks and place them all over the place. Super easy, super quick, super nice. I love it. I love it. I love it. Yes. So, the first obvious feature about these walls, this will be a little weird to do at the smaller scale, but, and actually I kind of can't with the size of that gate. This will be a little more of a showcase. This is pretty simple. It's just, let's see here. You're just gonna, what I like to do is pick the block at the base of whatever door frame you're doing. So like these are block or ashlar brick block, the brick blocks there. I just pick the same block to keep the same blend, right? Super easy, super simple. And then you just cut away with, of course, your large brush. I don't think it's even a brush, but I've done so much digital art that it's a brush in my mind. So the chisel is the brush, and I am the chisel. Yes, you just come through. Oh, hello. Goodbye. Just make it one sort of section out from the wall. If you're working at a smaller scale, you might want it finer. That's just how I like to do it. Come through and then use the smaller brush, and a really easy way to make that look nice is to just chip out the corners. I didn't even do it on this arch, at least on the outside. I did it on the inside, which does look a little better in my opinion, so I'll show you that. All you do is you just take out at the same 4x4, hello? Oh. The same 4x4 brush, you just take that out and you just chip out the inner lining, the inner layer of your doorway. Makes it look quite nice, in my opinion. For chunkier spots like this, especially at smaller scale, what I was saying earlier is I like to take out the corners. That's a really easy way to just make it not so chunky. And when you're doing this kind of roof, especially, this is kind of a mess. I'll go over that later. Most of the finer chiseling work is really just leaving it up to your eye, leaving it up to the vibes, the dream, the source. I made it the fuck up. You just kind of play with it until it looks nice. But a good rule of thumb is to chip away at those corners, round things out. Pretty simple. For the inner door, pretty simple. You just cut that out. And then in this case, we're just putting down a regular door. Nice and easy, nice and simple. The walls are a bit chunky for a build at this size. So I'll put the door here. But at larger scale, and part of the reason I used... What the... those aren't bricks. Part of the reason I used full blocks at scale and didn't get super dynamic with the sort of geometry of the base shape of the castle is because historically that wasn't super done. I mean, obviously people got really fancy, especially in the later medieval periods with the masonry. You look at, cathedrals and all these amazing works of simply divine stonework, right? But the earlier you go, the simpler and more practical that a castle's sort of base shape was. If you look at the round tower, kind of stereotypical fantasy castle from, I believe, the 13th century, there's basically nothing. It looks like plain stone cylinders with walls in between them, right? Super default castle look, but it's kind of practical. You don't want to chisel in the entire face of this wall, because if castles wouldn't be done that way, because you would want the walls thick to be resistant to attack. They are primarily military structures, or at least they were when they were invented. You could obviously get super fancy with fantasy style castles, stoneworks. I know, especially in Gothic designs, they get very, very fancy with it. But for the purposes of vintage story, the purposes of my taste, I prefer flat castle walls that are then detailed with further extrusions, right? Where was I going with this? So thickness of walls. Yes. So this gate, I can show you how to build it. Super simple. It's actually a single door surrounded by trapdoors. This is a very old Minecraft technique for building large castle gates. And the reason I use this instead of Vintage Story's dedicated gate blocks is because all of the gate blocks in Vintage Story are 2 blocks wide, which means the gates are 4 blocks wide, like in fullness. And that's not an odd number, right? If I'm building with the system I like to build with this, obviously I can make this gate a lot bigger, put a 4 wide doorway instead of this to make it work. But the thing is, this is a 3, 6, 9 wide wall. So there's not really a place in which these gates line up to be symmetrical with the sides of the wall. I really wish they would add, I don't know, 1 by 4s, 3 by 6s, I don't know, weirder gate styles to make it viable. Or, you could compensate with the design if you really want to use those, but obviously I learned building in Minecraft, and this is the way that I have always built those gates, and it works great. It's just a door. All you do is I'll go ahead and just build it on the, I'll just build it here. Just make a quick, dirty, sloppy door frame. Just like that. That's a little short. I'm just gonna copy this door frame. There we go. Okay. So all you do to make these, pick up that rock, put down the base door, and then you put down the side doors, the side trap doors. And how these are oriented is whichever way you're facing. So if you're facing this way, they get placed sometimes like that. If you're diagonal, I don't really know how it works, but you kind of have to get completely face on, facing that way, and then place, it might be that you have to place it on the, yeah, I think that's it. You have to place it on the orientation of the block that you want, which is weird. But yes. So you place those on there, and then you hold shift, and you can place them on top of each other as averted to placing them, like opening the door. If you hold shift, you can place things against them. That's a very, very old mechanic, right? You do that to regular doors. It's a little finicky. Typically what I'll do when I build these in survival is I'll build up a little tower and then shift place. This is going to be a little weird because it's on the inside of this block. I might have, is this, no, that's right. Not sure why. May have to break out the door to place these correctly. It worked fine on there. I didn't have to do it there, but either way. Yes, you just place those like that, and then you place your inner door backwards on the face of that, and now it makes a very smooth gate. Very smooth gate texture, I guess, wall. That looks quite nice. And because these are on the inside face of the block, I place them like backwards. What you can do is you can actually place blocks in front of them to then chisel out your door frame, right? So now you can get all fancy with it. You can go crazy, go insano style, getting super fancy with how you want your doorway, your carving, right? Your chisels. That is the gist on how you make doors like that. I have not tried building a gateway or doorway with the actual vintage story gate blocks for the reasons I discussed earlier. Perhaps I will experiment with that if I were to build this in survival or something. Or I could just do another creative design if you guys want to see how to approach that in that specific way. But that's the gist. That's the door. Those are the extrusions on the wall. And now we get to the fun stuff, my favorite stuff. Okay, so I, for a time, was very, very, very into reading about historical castle building. I didn't get super in depth because I don't have time to read, but I read enough to gather some basic features of castles and their names and their purposes to relay them to you. So, and I did them on that castle. We're gonna build this in a kind of weird, very slender design because I need space to build these at the same scale. I could build them smaller, but that would be, we'll see, yes. Yeah, I'm not even gonna blend the top there, whatever. So, this thing here is called a bretèche. I believe that's how that's pronounced. I think it's a French word, but basically what these are extrusions that go over a doorway that you're trying to defend as extra security so that people on the inside of the tower of the castle can actually go in here and they can fire down on attackers that are attacking the door, or oftentimes they have arrow loops, which are these little side things. You'll see them later. These are for firing out from a very, very well enclosed and defended position. It would be hard to shoot someone back through this, but you can shoot right through it. And that's something, a little spoiler about Vintage Story that I love. I love you, Vintage Story. Arrow. So we're gonna grab some copper arrows. If I have a bow, look at that. The hitbox, I can shoot through these. You can actually have a, oh, that one was weird. What the, okay. There we go. Okay, so it's, the hitboxes are a little wonky on the lower ones, but you can just fire out and you wouldn't, there we go. Yeah, so I could sit here all day, I could shoot down at people attacking the door. You know, historically there'd be a big mob of guys just in armor going up with a ram or something to break down the door. That is the point of a bretèche, or the origins of the bretèche. Later in later periods, later castles, what have you, they actually evolved into what is called a garderobe. which is for shitting outside of the wall. I don't know at which point they developed whether or not the bretèche came first. I believe the bretèche did, but don't quote me on that. I'm not a historian. I'm just a casual enthusiast. But that is what the bretèche is. These are super, well, they're a little tricky to build, but I'll go ahead and show you. The main features of the bretèche that you want to look out for are you want to carve out this opening like that. I think. Yes. Actually, wait, no. Wait, yes. Wait, no. Yes. Yes, no. I think. Yes. It gets a little tricky. But what you want are these little arch thingies going up the side. Those are how the bretèches are supported. I like to come in with the 2x or 4x4 brush, make them a little chunkier. You'll see that on a lot of existing examples of castles, or still existing castles, are that the bretèches sort of arch inwards. They get very fancy with the stonework. I believe I'm gonna go 2 high with this, or 3 high in total. Yes, 1, 2, 3. Yes. Actually, okay. So the top layer is the roof. Yes, bretèches come with. Hello. Oh, it's because I picked them. Oh, I chiseled that. Okay, I thought they were stairs. Let's see. Here we go. Yes. So what I did was I placed the whole block, and then I think, yes, and then I placed another one here. Actually, I think I did slabs for that, did I? Nope, those are full blocks. You can also chisel slabs, chisel stairs to cut down and save time on your actual chiseling work. Pretty straightforward. Just gonna come through here, and what I did for the front face was make almost a, what is that, a 1/4 slab or something? I don't know. I took the 4x4 and I just chiseled all of that out to get a nice little extruding roof on that. Very simple, very dirty. There's actually not much space on this one for an arrow loop. Not sure. Ah, that's why. Okay. I believe. Yes, that's what I did wrong. Okay. Yes, there's actually a whole block here as well. We're gonna get the 8x8 brush, and you just cut out the bottom like so, and then in here. Oh, hello. I just punched out the other wall. That's the funky thing about working in creative. The reach is insane. It's nice for building though. Yes. So I did. Yes. That is the gist of how to chisel one of these, just like that. And we'll get more into arrow loops in a moment. But for arrow loops, all you do is, what I like to do is take the 4x4 brush and go 1, 2, 3 pixels or sections over from the outer face of your wall, and punch that out. I believe, yes. So the arrow loops are in line, which means, okay, I built this correctly. Yes. 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. Just, oh, hello. Yeah, just like that. So now we have our 2 arrow loops and our little, I'm not sure what the exact configuration is on that one, but the principle is the same when you're building these really anywhere on any wall, above any door. It's the same process to build these. You just gotta play with the chiseling, and a nice way to know if you're doing it right is to go to the opposite side and look through your openings. That is the exterior of the bretèche. So the interior of the bretèche, and this goes the same for arrow loops, is you want to carve out, not dirt. There we go. You want to carve out a, hello, Oh, I think I had chisel blocks here. I got a little fancy with it. It's pretty easy to do. You just get the 8x8 brush, go along the edges, preferably without punching out your stone twice. Creative is a little wonky. Survival, I'm sure, would be a lot easier because when you punch blocks, they don't break. And I actually came through with a 4x4. This is quite a lot of chiseling work. These arrow loops, bretèches, they are a lot of chiseling work to get working properly. But I didn't even use the 1x1 brush, so it's still fairly straightforward as far as chiseling goes. And there you have it. So now, if I had a floor here, and I could just go ahead and put a ladder here for the sake of continuity. There we go. So yeah, now from in here, yes, I'm using a steel arrow. You can fire out into the attackers. I didn't do this on the other one, but you could probably chisel some of this. Oh, maybe even more. Not really sure exactly. I think I just left the slab there on the other one. Because obviously you don't want to leave too much space, otherwise return fire will get you. But there you go. That's a bretèche. Defensive feature, commonly used and placed over doors. They might have been placed over curtain walls as well. I don't know precisely, but I know they were commonly used above doors. Garderobes, I think, were kind of placed wherever, because obviously you could just shit. Which, funnily enough, a little note about this castle design is these bricks are anachronistic. Historically, castles were covered in, or castle walls, castle stone, were covered in plaster. So castles back in the day were actually painted white with plaster, or caked white with plaster, in order to weatherproof the stones so that the building would last longer. It would be more resistant to erosion, fire, I guess, that kind of thing. I don't know if stone can catch on fire, but you don't want to fire. Definitely erosion, though, weatherproofing. I know it was used for that. So historically, the castles would actually be white instead of like a bare stone that you see in ruins today. That is because those castles have been sitting there for hundreds to thousands of years. So a lot of the ruins in Vintage Story are ruins for a reason, and that's why you would use bare stone. But for the sake of sort of a fantasy aesthetic, and also kind of a more dynamic looking castle, I built a castle with wooden tools video, I used the white powder concrete sand for a more historical looking castle. And it ends up looking quite monotonous. Great for an overall image, but the closer you look at it, the more flat it looks. Now, to be fair, and this should be said, I do not know whether or not, especially in earlier centuries, or earlier castles, whether or not they would plaster the outer walls. I would assume, obviously, it's a lot of labor, so perhaps some castles, they just didn't, because it wasn't as important as just getting a castle up to be defensive. I don't know. But I know in the periods, especially when this upper feature, the timberwork and roof style from Central Europe, when that was used, it was very prevalent that they would put plaster on everything. If you look at castles in Czechia, for example, most of them have fancy plaster, fancy timberwork, instead of this bare, kind of ugly stone. It's not ugly in my opinion, but it is anachronistic. Rant over. Back to the castle, or the design. So, the next feature that we are going to go over is far simpler than our bretèche here, and that's going to be the arrow loops. Arrow loops, there are arrow loops in the bretèche, obviously, so you kind of already know what they are and what they're for. But you do put them along the upper levels of your wall. A key feature to note, if your castle was used militaristically, there would not be windows, because windows can be broken. You could probably get a ladder up and get through a window if you were besieging a castle. Castles did not typically have windows, at least on the exterior walls, the curtain walls, where you would be expecting to protect yourself. And especially, as far as I know, arrow loops would not be on the first floor of your castle level. I don't know, I'm sure maybe it was done. Don't quote me on this. I'm no expert with all of this. There's a massive disclaimer that I'm not a historian. I don't know shit. This is just what I've gathered from reading casually. But as I understand it, most of the defensive features would be higher up, obviously to allow better firing positions. But also, especially in the case of windows, they would not be there especially at lower floor levels, because you could just bust a window and get in the castle, right? Where was I? What was I thinking about? What was I talking about? Arrow loops, yes. So, arrow loops, super simple. Just like I said earlier, with the same design principle, you want to go the third, so because you're using a 4x4 brush, it's even, which is a little more difficult to work with, but I like to organize them on the further or the closer inner side of that 4x4 or 4x1 sort of arrangement, and I like to do that in a pattern towards the center of the build, right? So on this side, it's on the third 4x4 block furthest away. There's a 2-block space, or a 2-pixel sub-block space between the wall of the block and the inner side. So how that's done, very simply, let me make sure I have this I like to put my arrow loops at the same Y level because it makes it look nice and neat. So I notice I'm 2 blocks in, and I'm just gonna go 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 4, actually, on the outer arrow loops. And I believe they're actually a step downward from the other arrow loops. So in that case, what I would do is I would just chisel the block underneath it as well and carve out that little spot. And now that it's there, so we're going to do it on the opposite side, just like this. 2, 3, 4. Ta-da! There's your arrow loops. This feature in Vintage Story makes me very jealous, because in Minecraft, the best way I found to do them is with upside down stairs. Oh, it just becomes a pain. But if you're trying to work at smaller scales to make any kind of castle detailing work, Minecraft, you kind of just have to build bigger to fit any kind of detail, because everything works in whole blocks. But with Vintage Story, delightful, glorious Vintage Story, you can get as fancy as you want and as small of a space as you want. So that is how you chisel the outer layer of the arrow loop on the inside. And you'll notice, look at that, the arrow loop is at the floor level, as our bretèche and the bretèche's arrow loops. What I do is I come through with the 8x8 brush, and I chip out the whole block, the first block that actually has, I guess, the border between the 2 blocks that the arrow loop is against. I think these are, no, this is the same block. This is the same block, I think. Yeah, these are just the 2 different blocks. Yeah. So, cut out the area on the block above and the block below, so you can actually step in here. And then what I like to do is take our 4x4 brush and add back in, same thing we did with the bretèche, is this little detail here, just to make it look a little nicer. And I believe on the other tower, I think I chiseled, what the fuck? Okay, I guess that's one of the guards. Yeah, that's the, yeah, so I did chisel that. Okay, so there is a little bit of detailing there. I don't know why he's there when there's a lit campfire. My guess is he spawned up above and dropped down. Yeah, very, very unfortunate thing about building castles this way with historical military features is that There is no way in hell that you're going to be able to enclose these. You could probably enclose the bottom floor, I believe on the other castle it was, but especially if you're doing a spiral staircase or a more compound staircase like I did in that other tower, you're just not going to get enclosure. It's just, with the amount of chiseling you get to actually add defensive features, it's just not going to work. Which is unfortunate. I think historically, a lot of castles were used. Yes, I think historically, castles and keeps were used. This isn't a keep, it's just a tower, but they were used as residences. So the bottom floor would be used for storage or I think waste in some cases. But the actual upper floors, the second story, the third story, the fourth story of castle keeps would be lived in, residences, enclosed, right? And those floors, the upper floors, you do see windows because obviously if you're, I don't know, 30, 60 feet in the air, nobody's going to get up to that window. I do think in many cases they still weren't used, but I have seen windows on upper levels. Anyway, so they were used as residences, especially keeps. For outer towers, this is just kind of where guards would be stationed to fight off invaders, so the guards would suffer, or the garrison would suffer. I know historically and realistically, castles are very cold, very drafty, and not very fun to live in, which is why they would cycle shifts and not stay in them for very long, I would imagine. So that, I suppose that kind of works for Vintage Story. You can't enclose them, so in wintertime, it would suck royally to live in one of these things. But as a military structure, that is the purpose why. Yes. Castles, if you think about it, are basically just giant stone kind of ovens. I imagine in the summertime they would get very, very hot, and in the wintertime they would get very, very cold. I have heard. But those are the arrow loops, right? Very simple features. Just chisel out. I'm gonna do this on this side just for the sake of to keep things as they are, keep things even, show you the whole works. Yes. Just take the 8x8 brush, chisel out around the block that your arrow loop is in, and come back through with the 4x4 to, hello there. There we go. Yeah, that's a little note about chiseling. You have to always be chiseling technically against the face of whatever block you're chiseling. So I can't actually chisel here because there's no chiselable block to chisel against. That's pretty intuitive. I think most people know that, but it's just something I've noticed. So we have our arrow loops, we have our bretèche, we have our gates, we have our blended and extruded walls. That is pretty much the works for how to build one of these towers. The stonework, but now we get to my favorite part, the timber work. Yes, so this style of timber work, very common in Central Europe. It's beautiful, in my opinion, and I'm gonna teach you how to make it. I think in most castle designs that people make, you obviously have your merlins along the upper line, and then your like machicolations along the bottom, what have you, right? That's a very standard castle design that most people do. You can do that if you want. I could probably read up on how those are made, make them, and teach you how to make those if you want. But for my tastes, my preferences, we are sticking with this design. Yes, my favorite. So, this is pretty fucking cool to make. It's very simple. What you're gonna do is you're gonna grab your whole maple plank block or whatever wood type you choose. You're gonna place, just like we did on the medieval house, or really any build with good structure, good proportions, is you're gonna go out on top and make this little extruded layer of vertical planks, just like this. This will look a little funky because this is a small tower. I imagine it might look a little weird. But then you're gonna go 3 blocks up, right? So we go 1, 2, 3. Do that all around. When doing this in survival, I like to just walk along, place this as fast as I can. Sometimes, especially with the orientation, it gets a little funky. And Vintage Stories nerd polling is a little difficult. So if you're trying to do it that way, especially at larger heights, it's a bit tricky. There we go. So we have our 3 wide thing here, and it does look a little top heavy for our stonework here, but that's okay because chisels exist. So we're gonna do the same thing that we did on our medieval houses. We're just gonna cut out the outer 8x8 layer around the whole thing. And a method I described to make this go a little faster is to go through and right click all of the blocks that you're gonna be chiseling, like so. There we go, just like that. And then what you can do is you can just, what? Missed one. Then you can just come through and chisel the whole thing. Which in creative makes it very easy. In survival, I'm not sure what the block reach is or how that would work. It's a little finicky if you miss a block. But trust me, especially if you're doing large scale chiseling, this is much easier. Why do I keep breaking this? Much easier, and very especially, you will see when we get to it, when you're doing roofs like this, it sucks. You're gonna want to build it out of whole blocks first, and then go through and chisel it. In the same way, where you make all the blocks chiselable and then come through and chisel it, because when you start getting into, I've found, obviously people can do it however way they want, but what I've found is that when I'm chiseling very large shapes like this, especially with that giant kind of triangle arch shape, I'm still not super happy with the way that roof looks, but it's chiseling at that scale becomes very imprecise. You kind of just have to do it and throw shit at the wall to get it to look how you want it to, which if you're working at that scale, having to sit there and re-click every block as you chisel, accidentally misplace blocks, accidentally do all this, it's probably different in survival. Probably, it might be easier, I don't know. But especially in creative, having to manage that is kind of a pain. So doing this is very advantageous in my opinion, because it makes the chiseling go faster and a lot more seamless. I find when I'm chiseling at that scale, especially with a roof like that, and I constantly have to keep re-clicking blocks like this, and breaking them over and over like that. That was not a demonstration, that was an accident. It gets painful after a while. So doing it this way, just making everything chiselable and then going buck wild, just sculpt and chisel to your heart's content, makes it a lot easier. Okay, so moving on from that tangent, we're gonna come over here, we're gonna grab, where's a hitbox? Where are you, little buggers? Come on. There's one. Okay. So, for the upper layer of this, and this actually looks quite nice, I think, even at this smaller scale, we're going to do a very similar thing to the medieval house. We just come across, we're going to put beams everywhere. Everywhere. It might be cool looking to try different, mixing up beam types, block types, wood types, all that fancy stuff to get it really how you want it. But I have found, especially here in Vintage Story, things to me look a lot nicer when you have a simpler block palette. I think when you add too many different blocks, too many different colors, too many different textures, it doesn't look cohesive to me. I saw a post the other day of someone who was talking about block palettes and trying to find one that would make their build. I think the quote was they wanted it to not look like ass or something. And I said it in a comment on that post, but I think maybe not a lot of people, but especially with a game like this where there's just so many different options for blocks that you can use, things that you can do to those blocks, make them all super fancy. I find that working with, obviously, this is actually a lot more varied than my medieval house. If you look at the medieval houses, it's really just like 3 blocks: granite, cobblestone, tan, wattle, and daub, and then the red shingle roof, mixed in with some pine planks and pine timberwork. So really it's like 4 or 5 blocks that make up the entire build, right? And so in this case, we have granite rock, that's 1, flat rock, that's 2, ashlar bricks, that's 3, maple planks and beams, that's 4 or 5, and a slanted shingle roof, that's like 6. So this is a lot more complicated of a block palette, but I really, really encourage you, if you're struggling with building, to not worry so much about which blocks you're using, and more try and figure out ways that you can take those blocks and make them look nice. You've probably seen, especially if you follow Minecraft, there are people who have built castles and built fancy looking builds, crazy builds, out of just dirt or just cobblestone. And I think that's a really prime example that when it comes to especially larger structures like this, when you have so much room to work with, you can kind of just use whatever you want and really focus on getting the overall image of the building to look nice. I'm kind of rambling here, but that's the point. For the actual timber work here, as you can see, pretty straightforward. We're just doing basically a beam on every seam of the block except horizontally. So 1 around the bottom, 1 around the top, and then vertical lines across each midsection of the block where the blocks meet, right? Super simple, super straightforward, and it really gives a nice level of detail to those planks. The rest of the timber work is pretty straightforward. Again, very simple. You're just going to place a beam every other spot that you can place a beam. Like so. Sometimes you gotta finagle it to get it to look right. The more you do these kinds of timber works, the easier it becomes to just kind of eyeball where you're putting the beam. And the nice thing about doing these under kind of support sections is that the hitboxes, maybe. When there are hitboxes, they break pretty simply. They don't typically intersect with the upper timber works or get kind of annoying like they do on the medieval house that I showed. These are pretty straightforward, pretty simple, and look very nice once you get them all on there. It is kind of a tedious process to go through and do all these, but I almost find it kind of meditative, especially because you're not doing much with these beams. You're just kind of putting a ton of them. So once you get into the groove of how to place them and how to just keep placing them over and over, it becomes very, like, you almost hit like a flow state where you're just focused on doing this. It really scratches my brain. I don't know what that says about me, but I find it very therapeutic to do really monotonous detail work like this. Very fun, very simple. You're going to do that for all 4 sides of your tower. Or your wall. If you have a castle wall, a curtain wall, and you do hoardings, if you know what those are, they are basically temporary wooden structures that they would put around the outside and over top castle walls that didn't have timber structures or timber work on them. during a siege, right? To give more protection to the defenders, yada, yada, yada. They would also do stuff like this. I think in those cases, they actually had, I forget what they're called, but they're basically these tiny holes on the, underneath the kind of machicolations, the border of the tower wall. They would have these holes, probably not that big, I think like maybe that big, but they would have those lining a whole curtain wall, and that's where they would mount timberwork beams to put hoardings. Perhaps I'll go a lot more in depth and build hoardings of my own to show that off. I think that'd be really fun. I'm kind of a nerd when it comes to castles. I love them. I love them. But yes, that is our timberwork done. Super simple. Now we're going to get into the chiseling. We're just going to do the same thing we did with those arrow loops, but this time on the timber side of things. And I believe 2, 3. Yeah, these ones are a lot simpler. They're just on a single block, so you don't have to get crazy with it. But we're going to do the same thing we did last time, where we go 2 blocks in and pick the closer side to the center of each section. In between each of these beams, you're going to want one of these arrow loops. Now, once, especially when you're working in odd numbers, I think especially at this scale, you're going to get to a point where there's a little section like they don't line up. You can't do it like you did on the castle walls, because I believe this is a, what, a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Okay, so it's still odd. I don't know. For whatever reason, there's some math reason. I don't fucking know. What I do is I just put the left-hand side in the center and then continue that all around the build. It can look a little uneven, especially at smaller scale. That's not great. When you have a ton of them like this, it doesn't really pick out, at least to my eyes. Smaller scale, it's a little more obvious, a little more apparent. Perhaps you could just leave it full like that if you really wanted to, or you could maybe cut out both and make like a central window gap. But when you look at the Central European castles, Czechia specifically, those are the ones I love to reference. They are just single slits like this all across. Very thin, and many of them. So we're just going to do this to every side. And so what I was saying earlier about the symmetry of the arrow loops in the center, obviously it's on the left-hand side again. Just going to do that all around. There may be a better way of doing that. I guess, I wonder, hang on, let me try something. I could probably use the 2x2 brush. It's gonna be kind of a headache to chisel. Okay, that's pretty sweet. You can actually center it. Oh, that's awesome. I love this game. So, you can actually use the 2x2 brush to build another arrow loop. But centered on the block, which is so sick. That left-hand kind of trick that I was talking about is something I had to do and had to learn when building in Minecraft, because you obviously can't do this, and it becomes very annoying making things symmetrical in that game. But that looks very nice. That's lovely. I love that. I'm gonna do that to every side, actually. It is a bit more chiseling work. I'm very lazy when it comes to chiseling. I like to work in the bigger brushes and just do really as much as I have to in order to get the effect that I want. not necessarily kind of going overboard. I know in a lot of arrow loops historically, they get really fancy with the actual shape of the arrow loop. I think in some cases they add like horizontal sections so you could fit a crossbow. They get very, obviously, you know, with any artisanal thing in history, they get crazy with it because it's their life's career to do it. You can obviously go and do that for your own builds if you'd like. Maybe I'll explore that in future tutorials. I'll try and get kind of fancy and complex with it. But I personally really enjoy the simplicity of buildings constructed primarily for military purposes. You obviously wouldn't get super flowery on a castle that you expected someone to use a trebuchet on. I would imagine. Maybe they would. I don't actually know. But I would assume not. And it certainly makes your job or my job easier as a castle builder, especially when you're working at scale. If I were building 12 of these towers, there is no way in hell that I'm going to be getting super fancy with all the chiseling work, because I'm going to have to make that consistent across the entire gigantic build, which sounds like madness. It sounds like genuine insanity. Maybe I'll do that one day, but that would be more work than I can conceive at the moment. So there we go. That is our timber work done with a lovely discovery of that central arrow loop design. I might even do it to this bigger tower design, especially if I were building this in survival, I definitely would. But those are the basic features of that. Now we're going to move on to the roof. And roofs, let me tell you, they're weird. They're weird. Especially when you are working with more complicated roof designs. So if you look at a lot of Central European Czech castles, they are not triangular, they're sloped. They have almost like an arching box like a rhombus shape to them. It's weird. Those are the castle roofs and the castle style of castles that I am absolutely in love with. I think for a tower like this, you may want to make the timber work a little shorter, perhaps. I don't know. Maybe that'll look good. But yes, so roofs. When you build a roof like this, it becomes a game of just eyeballing it. You can typically how I did this roof, for example, is I came through and I placed hole blocks, right? Like a alpha or beta Minecraft build, you just come through with hole blocks and fill it out. The key thing to note that you're going to want to do if you're doing this style of roof is to start with a gradual slope towards the bottom that gets steeper the higher you go further into the build. Typically, I like to think of having a midway point, typically right at the first, after the first sort of ease up, so you get that slight shallow angle or wide angle and then a much steeper one the further up you go on the tower. You can see that is a lot more evident in this roof because it's smaller and I think more peaked. The actual historical and real examples are a lot wider, they're a lot boxier. Probably more like that, with a chiseled thing on top or something. The best advice I can give for building a roof like this is to find a real world example, a real life castle, real life, even just like artwork of a castle or a fantasy castle, if that's what you want to go for. Just find a reference and copy the hell out of it. Because when it comes to roofs, Finding a actual system with peaked and really just wonky roofs like this, it's madness. It's madness, especially if you're doing it at a scale like this. I would probably build a single roof, and then as painful as it would be, pick all the blocks and carry them over. I don't know. Or maybe take screenshots of the different angles and measure things out. I don't know. I don't know how I would do this in survival. Theoretically, I would just eyeball every roof and try and keep a consistent shape on all of them, and pray to God that you can't tell the difference when you're looking at it from further away. But yeah, you're just gonna wanna, you really, with these kinds of roofs, it is all just an eyeball game. The best advice I can give is to chisel a little, then step back, kind of squint at it, look at it, almost like you're painting or something. Just to get the bigger image, the bigger picture of what it is that you are chiseling. Because obviously, if I were to try and do some precise system for this, I think I would go insane. As if I wasn't already. So, as you can see here, the roof is a little chunky towards the midsection. So we're just gonna come up here. Oh, hello. That's prime example of the chiseling thing I was discussing earlier. It is doable. I'm sure, especially in survival, it would be a lot easier to just chisel each block normally, as opposed to doing all of them. But especially in creative mode, if you misclick, it's frustrating. So we're gonna move back. We're gonna kind of stare at it, squint at it. I think that top roof could be a little more peaked, a little more gradual. So we're gonna get actually our 4x4 brush. And we're just gonna come around here. It's almost making a cylindrical shape, which I'm not super fond of. Roofs are just, especially when you're chiseling, there's not really a rhyme and reason to it. It is quite frankly just a lot of eyeballing and a lot of practice. There we go, that's slightly better. I still think this spot here. One nice thing about creative mode, and something that I did on that castle, is that I can just sit back here as far away as I want and chip away at it. And just find a roof profile that looks good at that angle, right? So we're gonna shave off a little hair. This probably isn't gonna translate very well to a video. But you'll notice now that specific angle has the roof shape that I want. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna come up here. I guess you could probably attempt this in survival, I don't know. But then now that you have a single section that looks good at that angle, you just go through and you copy what you did on that section closer up. So I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. We're just gonna copy that on the same layer as everything else. So it becomes really a game of noticing what you did different and copying it over. Pretty simple. Once you get the hang of it, it becomes a lot more natural. And so now, as we look from this angle, the roof looks great. If I stand down, it's still definitely a little chunky, especially around these little seams, these little edges here. I obviously didn't do that side yet, but it looks much better. I have no earthly, unearthly, unholy idea how I would do that in survival. I guess I would like take a screenshot. I don't know. I don't know how I'd replicate that in survival, to be honest. 2, 3, 6. 1, 2, 3. Kind of a funny idea I had. This isn't the first time that I've played Vintage Story. I first got it back in like 2023. And I started a castle in a world with my brother. And kind of a funny idea I had was to take a smaller piece of stone like this, and then I shaved off the top layers. I wish I still had this world so I could show you at like a better scale. But basically what I did is I took a platform like this, and I took the one by one block, and I literally just built the outline of the castle as like a little diorama. It's like a little blueprint, a little map. So like we'd have a wall there, we'd have a 2 wide, or a tower there. We'd go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Then come through, do the same thing here. And you would plot out the floor plan, and I think I tried doing a 3D version where I built like higher and all that, but it got a little tricky to work with. I do know, from what I've read, this is something they did historically, was to blueprint the floor plan of the castle. And this, instead of using like a Photoshop or some kind of grid, you can actually just do it in Vintage Story with chiseling, which is pretty cool in my opinion. I don't know what that has to do with the roof. I think I was just yapping, but that's just a fun little thing that I had in one of my old Vintage Story worlds. I'm really sad that I have a really bad habit of deleting worlds, and so most of the Vintage Story worlds that I started playing the game on are gone. I have a few of my Minecraft ones that I want to tour in some future video. But the only Vintage Story builds that I have of like my old work before I started getting really into chiseling is on a server. So maybe if I get a world download of that, I could go through and just kind of show what my builds used to look like. But I am on a mythically off the road tangent. But yeah, you'll notice this entire time I have just been, I took the single section here and I've just been observing and copying it all the way around to get the roof how I want it to look. And I believe that is pretty much good. For these inside pieces, what I did is I just put whole shingle blocks and then I chiseled it on the inside. Pretty straightforward, pretty simple. Just like that. And now, if we come here, I think that roof looks much, much better. It is definitely kind of insane coming through and chiseling roofs like this. If I were doing a full castle in survival, I think I would just go mad. But that is how it is done. Roughly. Again, with roofs, especially chiseling like this, at this scale, especially a scale like this, or even larger, it's just a game of eyeballing, to be honest. Find a picture, a reference that you like, a specific angle of whatever you're trying to build that almost like a facade, and then try and copy it and arrange it around the rest of the castle, or the tower, or the build. This applies to really any build, to fill things out and build a full structure. So there we have it. There is our little tower with all of our little militaristic features. That should be it, I think. So thank you for watching. Hopefully this video isn't god-awful long. I'm trying to break my old habit of making hour-and-a-half long videos. But hopefully you learned a thing or two, especially about like military history of castles in a very casual and not very professional way. Just kind of things that I've picked up on. Hopefully you can apply them to your own worlds. I'm definitely going down a very deep rabbit hole by starting to do castle stuff. I think I might do like a tavern or something smaller scale with mixing in principles from here and from the medieval houses. I'm not sure what I'm going to do next, to be honest. But this is the castle tower tutorial. I hope you enjoyed. Subscribe if you did. I'd appreciate a like. And I'll see you all next time.